Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea Tour is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, David Hayes, and Polar Inertia Journal, an outlet for artists and researchers documenting the urban condition at polarinertia.com. So why does the whole world seem to know what K-pop is?
Well, in 2014, for whatever reason, people around the world are now aware of K-pop, Korean pop music that, for whatever reason, has now gone worldwide. Although I think for a lot of industry people, the buzz has really been here for years. Through the 90s and early 2000s, K-pop was probably one of the best-selling genres all across Asia, whether it be Japan, Hong Kong, Southeast Asia. But the real breakout and breakthrough was probably over the past 5 years when Korea, which is arguably the most wired and wireless country in the world, always known for being kind of a digital trendsetter. It was very interesting because Korea is a country where youth culture, pop culture, and digital culture are actually one and the same. And so when this convergence kind of really collided, with things like YouTube and iTunes all starting to become accessible and available to Korean fans, but more importantly, worldwide fans, we started seeing Korean boy bands, Korean girl bands, Korean indie acts, icon acts, idol acts, all making headway not only across Asia, but more importantly, beyond Asia. And then obviously the breakthrough moment, the breakthrough guy was Psy. And then all of a sudden the whole world was talking about, we've heard the buzz, now we're seeing the reality. And, you know, I think in many ways Psy kind of really broke the stereotype of people's perceptions as to what K-pop is. I mean, obviously, you know, he was a little bit older than what most people assume K-pop would be. You know, he was rocking a different kind of six-pack, you know, rather than, you know, the tight sort of belly. It was more the six-pack belly. And just the fact that, you know, he was, you know, having fun creating this video that obviously went viral. I mean, I think most people knew at some point K-pop would break out. Just no one expected it would be that guy with that video at that time. I think in hindsight, it was probably a good thing, maybe a great thing, and perhaps the best thing. It was him because he has really opened a lot of doors, opened a lot of eyes and ears to the Korean music scene. And, you know, I think it's just amusing that, you know, he's really had a ripple effect because of Gangnam Style. YouTube has said that, you know, that the awareness and viewership of K-pop videos around the world have tripled. And the fact that in addition to Psy, you know, we have more and more Korean artists charting around the world on different genre charts and starting to be invited to and perform at some of the biggest music festivals around the world. And in some instances, some acts are doing world tours where they're selling out clubs, selling out venues, and in some cases even selling out arenas.
It's here in the Garosu-gil district of Seoul, Korea, one of the centers of one of the hotspots of this wireless culture, that I'm speaking with Bernie Cho. He is the president of DFSB Kollective, an agency devoted to the media, the marketing, and the distribution of K-pop worldwide. He's also an experienced expert in the Korean music industry. And let me follow up with something more about Psy. I mean, it seems like it's strange that a guy who would be an outlier, who would seem like such an outlier in K-pop, would also be its representative on the world stage, right?
I mean, I have to say that, you know, I think it's a fascinating story as how this guy, who obviously was one of the biggest K-pop stars in Korea, but he was in many ways, he was sort of the bad boy that became the golden boy. And, you know, I think it's great. And I think one of the reasons his sort of popularity really resonated not only in Korea, but outside of Korea, is he has a story to tell. You know, he's hit the top of the charts, but, you know, he's had a few speed bumps. He's had a few scandals along the way. And so, you know, for a lot of K-pop, sort of management companies, there's always this sort of pursuit of perfection. Right. And he came out as imperfect as it could be, And being imperfect, I think, actually probably was the perfect way to break out.
America likes that story where people get over their imperfections and succeed nonetheless. Korea likes that less?
Well, I think, again, because a lot of the boy bands and girl bands that were finding success across Asia, in many ways were molded, and maybe some people go so far as to say manufactured, to the point where the perfection of the way they dance and the way they sing and the way they perform and the way they look and the way they sound was something that was really packaged and perhaps maybe overpackaged. And again, I think that what was really fascinating about Psy is, everyone loves a comeback story, but this is a guy that had not one, not two, but I think 3 comebacks. And so the fact that, he was able to, come back from scandals that usually would bury other people's careers, he was able to find ways to, resurrect himself and to, credit where credit's due by being honest that, he had made some mistakes. He had a few missteps along the way. And I think one of the reasons why, he was always, embraced by fans and by the public was the fact that, he didn't hide the fact he was very human. And then, again, the way he's handled the success, I think, he has really sort of, proven concept that, you don't have to necessarily sing entirely in English to have a hit on your hands. B, I think he really showed that, in order to find success overseas, actually coming out and coming across as made in Korea is actually perhaps a good thing because maybe people are looking for something different. And then 3, I think, as much as people say content is king, here's a guy who also brought context in the sense that, when he walks the red carpet or does an interview, he has a story to tell. And the most important thing is he expresses those stories not only with wit, not only with humor, not only with intelligence, but also in English. And I think that for a lot of younger artists, he's in his own way kind of paving the way in terms of how to succeed overseas. And I think what comes out very loud and clear is be natural. If it can, try to be unscripted. And, more importantly is just be comfortable expressing yourself. And I think for a lot of younger Korean artists, they maybe stick too close to the script and maybe try to do things maybe too by the book. And I think the fact that, I think it also helps that Psy is not only a singer and songwriter, but also an artist and a producer. I would probably have to put parentheses around the word dancer, but he's a very interesting, fascinating entertainer that I think, he's been really good in terms of raising the awareness of not just K-pop, but just Korean music as a whole.
Right. And did you sense at the time of Gangnam Style, any reaction in the Korean music industry like, wait, what? Him? He's the one who's breaking the rest of the world? Like, well, okay, we gotta like the screeching sound of a needle on a vinyl record. Like, wait, hold on. Was that a reaction at all?
Well, the thing with Psy is that he had signed up and was part of one of the biggest, most respected artist management companies in Korea called YG Entertainment. And, YG Entertainment was representing arguably one of the, if not the top boy band, Big Bang. Arguably, if not likely the biggest girl band in Korea, 21, and they also happened to have one of the top hip-hop acts, Epic High. I mean, so they had an all-star roster of artists, all of them who were finding different degrees of success overseas. And I think to a lot of us in the industry, there was just this assumption that it was going to be one of those bands that was going to make the breakthrough. Each and all of them had all found different degrees of chart success. So the momentum was there. The talent was obviously there. And in many ways, I actually didn't even know Psy was coming out with a new album because he had just gotten back out of the military. His second tour of duty, not his first, but his second tour of duty. He had already been signed up to be a judge for one of these sort of talent shows. Right. And, similar to the way it is in America or in the UK, usually if you're a judge on these shows, it's sort of their way of saying, you've had a good career. This is a great way to sunset into something new.
Emeritus at that point.
Exactly. You're the honorary emeritus celebritus.
Paula Abdul.
Exactly. And so he was well on that sort of very comfortable track. And then out of nowhere, that single and that video dropped. And everyone in the industry is like, yo, have you seen Psy's new video? Have you heard the new song? And, I think to a lot of us, we looked at it, it's like, wow, he's making a comeback. This is a really interesting song, but my God, the video is just off the hook. And I mean, for me, as soon as that little kid was just working those dance moves, I mean, I was locked in. And, I think with Psy is that, he had already tapped into what many other top Korean artists were doing in terms of, working social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. But the thing with Psy is not only did he work it, he owned it. And then the fact that it went viral, the fact that I think a lot of, international, celebrities and artists and musicians were also just spreading the word. It's like, have you seen this crazy video coming out of Korea? And, he basically it just exploded from there. And then, I think, obviously when something goes viral, you look at your watch and you're wondering, okay, when is this 15 minutes of fame going to expire? But what kept him relevant, and I think, he really made a smart choice and a smart move, although he was working with one of the top talent management companies here in Korea, right as things were about to explode bigger, he teamed up with Scooter Braun, who I think most people know is the manager that represents Justin Bieber, who, most people forget that Justin Bieber himself was also a YouTube phenomenon that was discovered, out of Canada. And so the fact that he surrounded himself with, I think the right people, not only took Psy to new levels and create new records and form new benchmarks, but he managed to basically turn this sort of flash and this fad into phenomena. And, the fact that, a year and a half, 2 years later, we're still talking about him.
Right.
And, he's still breaking records in different ways.
You mentioned the reaction to the Gangnam Style video, like, oh, this is so crazy, this is nuts, look at this. Like, I remember a writer I like, Douglas Copeland, saying, the first time I saw Gangnam Style, I felt like I was high. And it's certainly that got a lot of traction. But then I've also heard Korean friends worry that, like, as Korea gets more and more discovered, as Korean pop culture gets more discovered by Westerners, especially Americans, are they going to think, like they thought of Japan, oh, this is a weird place. This is a place of craziness, an incomprehensible place. That seems implausible to me. Korea just seems less likely to seem weird to America than Japan does. But what are your thoughts on that? Is weird Korea, is that a label that has any sticking power?
For me, I think the power of Psy's video obviously was humorous, but it also showed sort of, a side of Seoul and obviously a side of Gangnam that, frankly, a lot of people in Korea maybe perhaps overlooked or maybe just underestimated. But the fact that his eye was tuned into what he felt was unique and what he felt was amusing and turned it on to the world and frankly maybe turned on the world to this idea is we have to visit Korea. I think, the government, they're always happy to spout out numbers of the fact that tourism has risen and the fact that we do see a lot of tourists here in Gangnam. I mean, we're in Gangnam right now and, on the weekends, Korean's probably the least spoken language now on the street because you have a lot of European, Japanese, Chinese, Southeast Asian tourists, which I think is great.
There's no one language on those streets.
Yeah, and then the fact that, any shop or any cafe or any restaurant you walk into now is so aware and maybe even appreciative of how cosmopolitan Gangnam has become that they're all comfortable, taking orders in different languages, which I think is great. But the thing is that I think that what Psy did was really just sort of put a maybe not so much an apostrophe, but maybe perhaps an exclamation point on sort of what Made in Korea stands for. Because I think for a lot of international, not fans, but really consumers, there's really this aura, this sort of image that anything coming out of Korea these days has sort of this hip, hype, cool factor, whether it's, the industrial design on Samsung smartphones or LG TVs or Hyundai cars. I think this idea that Korea has gone from this sort of imitation to innovation phase, I think is one thing that clicks. And then I just sort of look at the aura ripple effects of the success of maybe Korean athletes, Korean sports, and Korean cuisine. I think, most people have fallen in love with, Korean yogurt, frozen yogurt, I should say, to, learning to appreciate soju as a mixer in any sort of cocktail out there. And the fact that, right now there's a high awareness of Koreans even in Hollywood. And so I think that, this building sort of momentum of, what are Koreans, what is Korea, what is from Korea, Psy came out and was really able to, just sort of, I think, solidify what was already sort of a work in progress. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of things come out cool, a lot of things come out, fresh. And, so what if something comes out humorous? I think it only just adds a little bit more sort of color and flavor to what people are now kind of picturing what Korea represents.
To extend the K-pop to J-pop comparison a bit, you are obviously working at the intersection of technology and music with the Korean music industry. And as you say, it's blowing up as technology too, as music technology is itself blowing up. Now, when J-pop got big in the West in the 90s, it was a very different technological time. What has changed? What important things have changed between the sort of J-pop boom 20 years ago and the K-pop boom now, technologically?
Well, I think when a lot of people obviously compare Japan and Korea, whether it's with football to baseball and now music. And I think the difference between sort of the J-pop buzz from 20 years ago to the K-pop boom now, I would have to say really revolves around three things. I think one of it has to do with traditional media versus social media. 20 years ago, if you found out about a Japanese band, like Shonen Knife or Mad Capsule Market or whatnot, chances are you heard it through perhaps maybe, a radio station, or it got a write-up in a magazine, or it was literally word of mouth buzz.
About it in Giant Robot.
Giant Robot or Spin or Ray Gun or whatever. And, I personally liked a lot of the Japanese bands that were trying to make it out here to the U.S., but for whatever reason, they didn't get a lot of traction. And I think part of it might be the fact that there's a lot of talented Japanese music acts who maybe don't feel the need to leave Japan, because Japan is such a huge music market. It's number 2 in the world overall, and number 1 if you're into physical music, CDs.
What about Japan makes it that? Because there's countries that are the size of Japan that are not that position in terms of music market.
Well, I think the Japanese are obviously, are huge music fans. They have some of the biggest and best music festivals in the world. And at the time, they had the technology. I mean, we were talking about Sony and JVC and Hitachi and Panasonic, similar to the way we talk about Samsung and LG. But Sony created, the pre-iPod. They had the Walkman. Yeah. And, the thing is, though, is that, a lot of the buzz that the J-pop and Japanese acts had 20 years ago, I don't know if they were able to sort of convert that and translate that into maybe commercial success in the U.S. or in other international markets. And I think part of it had to do with technology limitations. Fast forward now 20 years later to sort of, K-pop. One of the differences is that Korea is a much smaller market than Japan. And so for a lot of Korean artists, in order to be truly financially successful, they need to break out of Korea. And so from the get-go, there's
at least to the rest of Asia.
Right. And there's this export mindset. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Korea swings way above its weight. It's the 4th largest net export music market in the world, behind the US, the UK, and Sweden. And it's a top 10 music market in the world, bigger than China and India. And so, Korea is a very important market locally. But, from the turn of the century, Korean music acts always felt the need and desire to basically break out of Korea. And so, right around the late 90s to the early 2000s, a lot of Korean acts started experimenting and exploring with going to Japan and going throughout Asia. But the real breakthrough really was sort of in the past few years, because thanks to the internet, Korean artists were able to go direct international worldwide. And so there was this connection between promotion opportunities to commercial opportunities. And a lot of Korean artists were then able to convert and translate the busyness they were seeing online into a real business, offline, around the world, on air, you name it. And I think a lot of Korean music acts were really able to literally and figuratively capitalize on this merger between technology and the internet and going international. And I think, 20 years ago, a lot of Japanese acts didn't have these platforms and perhaps these luxuries. But now any artist from any country has these opportunities. And again, I think by virtue of Korea being a very digerati society, the fact that there was the hardware, there was the software, and there was the infrastructure. I mean, this was a very sort of potent cocktail that was just waiting to explode, and it did.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're Korean American, born in the States, but you now go back and forth. Tell me, when did you first become aware of what Korean pop culture was?
Growing up in the U.S., there weren't really a lot of sort of Asian, let alone Asian American sort of heroes or role models, or for that matter, pop culture references. I mean, it was basically Bruce Lee, and that was it. But it was really during college where, in the early 90s, where this idea and awareness of not just Asian pop culture, but even Asian American pop culture was kind of sort of emerging. And I remembered I took an Asian American class, a term off. I was attending Dartmouth, which was way up north where there was a lot of snow. And I said, I need to go as far as possible from that. And I actually chose, your backyard, yes, your neck of the woods, UC Santa Barbara. And
my alma mater.
And I basically thought I was going to take the easiest courses I could possibly think of. And I stumbled into Asian American Studies, which I thought was like, wow, this is going to be super easy. But it turned out it was a very fascinating, almost eye-opening, and I think in some ways a bit of an epiphany for me because, at that time I was very much, thinking I'm going to be on this sort of, corporate America, consulting, law, business, track. And then I really
on a Korean American track.
Yeah. Basically, whatever my mom and dad thought was the right thing to do. But then I got to California, and obviously the diversity really opened my eyes. And then when I took these classes at UC Santa Barbara, there were no textbooks. I was like, this is really strange. Why are there no textbooks? And the reason is it was such a new field that everything was Xeroxed from magazines or newspapers, and there were really no books to read. I was like, wow, this is not good. And, but then I realized that all people were doing is complaining about misrepresentation in the media. And I realized
100 pages on Charlie Chan you have to read for this course. Right?
Yeah, things about, discrimination, emasculation. And I'm thinking, I didn't sign up for a Boohoo session, and I started discovering things like Giant Robot and things that in California, I realized, there is a burgeoning scene. There are people trying to write, that are trying to direct, that are trying to act. And I realized that, maybe going into media might be a better and smarter, choice. And so at that point, I just, I started thinking more about moving away from academia and from corporate and towards media. And I was always a huge music fan. When I was in California, I was relentlessly every week checking out concerts, going to check out live shows whenever, wherever. And so, my brief time spent in California definitely sort of took me onto a different path. And then it was after college where I sort of basically pursued my interest in Asian American pop culture all the way really to Asia. So it led me to come out to Korea. In college, I graduated. I changed my major to government and Asian studies. And I originally came out to Korea to become an academic. I had signed up to go to graduate school at Yonsei University. And I ended up dropping out of grad school a week before classes started because I happened to have met a guy at a club for a film cast and crew party that I crashed, who said he was going to start a music channel.
Sure you are.
And I didn't believe him, and it turned out to be true. And, he asked me to interview, and I ended up getting the job. And honestly, back then, I didn't think there was a future in Korean music, let alone Korean music television. But,
what did the cultural landscape look like at that moment in Korea?
Well, when I had first arrived in Korea, and again, this was the idea that I was trying to study to be a professor, I spent a lot of time in the Korean art school district known as Hongdae. And one of the reasons I spent a lot of time there was because it was one of the few places where the cafes and clubs were playing MTV Asia via satellite all day long. And I was a huge fan of MTV growing up in the US, and the fact that there was something in Asia for me was, a mental relief, because the Korean music I was watching on network TV, was awful. This was karaoke taken to another degree, and I would watch a lot of the early Korean music videos and a lot of these Korean sort of, top of the pops, shows. And it was a painful experience.
So this is like early 90s music.
90s. And, and I knew there was some interesting acts coming out, because when I was going to Hongdae, this was the indie music scene. And what I was watching on TV and what I was seeing in indie clubs were completely different. The indie clubs definitely were catering to sort of my fascination, obsession, for alternative music or hip hop music or even electronic music. And so, I basically thought, look, if there was a way, even if it was 1%, to sort of work inside the system to get some of this music and some of these acts into the, onto the channels and into the airways, I'll take that risk, I'll make that jump and see what happens. And I was very lucky that the people I worked with that launched the music channel here in Korea, Mnet, were very forward-thinking people who just dived right into this whole new sort of cultural landscape. So it was really exciting times. And, again, I look back, I remember the first day the first music video went on air, and I literally cringed. I was like, wow. I honestly didn't know whether to laugh or cry.
Really? What was going on?
Well, the videos, you could tell that there was so much effort to make it look cool. It had the exact opposite effect.
Trying too hard.
And at the same time, because the karaoke noribang culture was so strong here, that a lot of the videos felt like you couldn't really watch them. You had to sing along to them. But what was amazing was, in a short amount of time, the quality of not only the music, but especially the music videos really took off by leaps and bounds. And so what used to be sort of a source of embarrassment very quickly became a source of pride. And I think in the late 90s, through music television channels, but more importantly, being distributed through satellite and through cable, really helped spur sort of the first Korean wave, because through these music channels, whether it was MTV or Channel V or other regional channels, all of Asia, all the Asian youth, all of a sudden became exposed to different music from different countries. And for whatever reason, I think sort of hand in hand, as Korean TV dramas were raising their awareness in Asia, Korean movies were raising their awareness in Asia, Korean music and music videos were also along for that ride. And so the late 90s was a very interesting time, because we saw the first wave of Korean acts finding different degrees of success around Asia. But then the internet happened, and it really sort of, it didn't just change the rules, it changed the game. And so the commercial viability and success of a lot of artists were just completely devastated through, piracy sites, illegal MP3 downloads. And, Korea, also had their IMF crisis, when basically the Republic of Korea had to declare bankruptcy and asked the International Monetary Fund for a huge bailout loan. And that really took a huge impact on sort of the Korean national psyche. But some good came out of it, because the government, they decided that if they have to invest on the next big thing, instead of going perhaps industrial, they went internet. And so
instead of shipbuilding, it's the net.
Instead of, cars and ships and TVs, they actually said, what? Let's invest in broadband. Let's invest in high-speed internet. And so what we saw was the Korean government put into place, invested big on the internet. And all of a sudden, we saw really a whole new, not only digital revolution, but in many ways a cultural revolution, because all of a sudden, some of the newest, not only millionaires, but billionaires were tech guys. we started seeing new business models emerge because Korea had gotten so advanced in technology that a lot of new digital trends were breaking here in Korea first rather than overseas. I mean, people talk about Facebook, but Korea had something before that called Cyworld. People talk about Skype, but here in Korea they had something called Dialpad. And so a lot of sort of the things we take for granted, around the world, a lot of the early roots and starts actually we saw here in Korea. And then as a result, what happened is that the Korean music industry was so devastated by the internet and through MP3s that Korea went full blown going digital. And in fact, in 2006, Korea was the first country in the world where actually digital surpassed physical sales. And, Korea became sort of a very fast forward market for digital music and digital sales. And as a result, we started seeing a rebound. But the thing was, though, is that as the Korean music industry was rebounding, everybody was making money except for the artists.
None was left by the time it got down to them.
There were so many cooks in the kitchen and there were so many hands in the cookie jar that at the end of the day, the artists were really left with crumbs. And so on the outside looking in, to many industry people, Korea was a very sort of rosy market. People would look to Korea as like, this is the future of the music industry. But if you're here on the ground in the trenches, it was a very different story. It wasn't so much rosy as it was thorny, because at the end of the day, the price of music was often really low. The revenue sharing was often really low. And so for a lot of Korean artists, it was an issue of, they basically realized that if they were going to be successful, they would have to really sort of pivot and revamp and rethink what their careers could be. A lot of Korean music artists, if they happen to be young and work with a lot of these top artist management companies, decided to go the celebrity route, saying, you know what, let's make more money. Let's use music not as a business, but as a business card to open doors to become an actor or become a model or go into musicals.
There seems to be an unusual amount of crossing over with Korean celebrities. Like, if somebody's a celebrity here, it seems like they're a general celebrity. They'll do anything.
Yeah, I mean, the irony is that in Korea, they call celebrities talent.
Yes.
And they have to show different kinds of talent. But often if they try to do too much, it makes you wonder whether there's really talent there. But the reality is, the market reality is that, for some music companies, they realized that they had to groom their acts to become celebrities and become profitable that way. Many did. And some of them turned out to be good actors, obviously good-looking models. And then for other artists, they realized that they would have to perhaps focus more on amazing live shows, more concert tours. And so really, artists here were forced to diversify their revenue streams. But the thing is that Korea, in many ways, because it was such a digitally advanced country, that it actually was sometimes more of a curse than a blessing, because there was so much homegrown technology. And when the homegrown social media solutions started popping up, what happened is that we had in Korea created a whole new DMZ, not just a demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea. We had created a whole new digital media zone that basically was a closed garden that prevented Korean artists from basically exploring what their fan bases could be outside of Korea.
This is Korea only technology means Korea only exposure.
Exactly. And so, so for a lot of overseas fans that were curious about Korean music or Korean acts, they could not discover Korean music because the big portal sites, the big search engines, the social media platforms here had pretty much closed off all the traffic, all the searches, all the queries into Korea about Korea. And so what we saw was basically this sort of really perfect storm of social media coming together in Korea, where you started seeing Korean artists and management companies start embracing not just the local, but more importantly, the global platforms. And so when artists who had really grown frustrated with trying to penetrate and trying to lobby traditional media, trying to get on radio, trying to get on TV, trying to get into newspapers and magazines, when they turned their attention to reach out direct to their fans through Twitter, through Facebook, through YouTube, and follow up that buzz with iTunes sales and now more and more with all different music stores, we saw a boom happen. It was, like I said, a perfect storm where when Korean music industry embraced the global social media platforms and jumped onto sort of the international, music stores, we just saw a rapid growth in the music industry. The Korean music industry, because it was digital, was experiencing pretty solid single-digit and at times double-digit growth year on year, and that's great. But over the past 5 to 6 years, when it comes to the export business, we were seeing not only double, but even triple-digit growth. As a result, you were starting to see a lot more Korean artists not only trying to debut in Korea, but more importantly, outside of Korea.
Now, you've described the music landscape such as you found it in the 90s in Korea and Seoul, but what was the city itself like when you got here, first as an adult?
When I came to Korea almost 20 years ago, Korea was very much an emerging economy in the sense that at the time you could only hear and see and smell construction. Whether it was roads to high rises to stores. I mean, it was noisy, it was messy, it was just busy. But over the years, especially in the 90s, I started seeing a lot of not only growth, but I think sophistication, where Korea emerged from being an emerging economy to now being, a legit, top 10, top 20 economy. And I think, whether it was through Korean brands sort of exerting their influence and growing awareness worldwide to Korean celebrities to just sort of Korean exports. It was very exciting to see this transformation where Korea, in many ways, it was called the Hermit Kingdom for a reason. It was very insular. It was very homogenous. But then I think, the fact that when Koreans, whether they be corporates or whether they be celebrities, were all finding different degrees of commercial success outside of Korea, I think it spurred a lot of sort of self and perhaps national confidence. And then, I think for me, when the World Cup happened in 2002, between Korea and Japan, all of a sudden there was this sort of feel-good kind of mindset and sort of vibe. And it just really carried over and has really just expanded, quite a bit since then. And so I think Korea, pre-2002 and post-2002, has gone and become far more cosmopolitan, far more international. 20 years ago, I would have never thought of Korea as being sort of trendy. But now I feel like I'm the old guy I used to make fun of because, things here move so fast. And it's really interesting to see that in the same way that I used to look at perhaps London and Tokyo growing up in college as sort of being kind of pop culture hot zones, to kids growing up now, Seoul is now part of that sort of hot city matrix that I just never imagined, but, I'm glad it's happened.
Now, you have a foot in America as well. You go to Los Angeles seemingly every few weeks, and Los Angeles is where I live and where half the interviews on the show happen. Los Angeles is kind of having a moment of its own right now, as Seoul is. Do you think the cities have much to learn from one another?
In terms of how to handle traffic, for sure. But I think, what's very interesting is that, obviously in Los Angeles, there's a huge Korean American population there. And I think what's really interesting is in the same way that Los Angeles is really a very diverse city of different ethnicities, Seoul right now is kind of moving in that direction. Right now, I think close to maybe 10% of the population in the city are non-Koreans, and it's been growing every year. And just the fact that, there are a lot of international companies, a lot of international residents, Seoul has really become a very international city. And so I think, Seoul could perhaps learn a bit maybe from LA in terms of, how to sort of embrace that and make it work. But at the same time, I think there's a lot that LA could learn from Seoul because, Obviously, there's a lot of things about Seoul's infrastructure, whether it's technology, whether it's transportation, or, for that matter, even like, recycling. Seoul's surprisingly a very green city. And, for me, it's great. When I first came to Korea, I used to cough all the time because the pollution was so bad. And now, blue skies, people recycle paper, plastics, everything. And so it's really interesting to see that transformation. And again, I think because so many people, Korean and non-Koreans, are going back and forth so much to LA and Seoul, I think, people will in their own ways find their own means to sort of extrapolate what each city can learn from each other.
What kind of perspective do you think having grown up in America gives you on Korea, on Korean culture, on sort of what happens in Korea?
Well, I think whatever perceived kind of advantage I might have had being from America and living in Korea for a long time, I think is gone.
Really?
Because I think a lot of Koreans, be it young or be it old, they travel more overseas. Many of them study more overseas. Many of them live overseas. And so as a result, I think Koreans, whether they have a Korean passport or a non-Korean passport, have collectively just become more, I think, globalized and more internationalized and perhaps maybe more progressive, but maybe coming at it from two different directions. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that, and again, I think a lot of it has to do with technology. Information travels so fast that, whether it's news to whether it's fashion to whether it's trends, I find that, there are times really that sometimes the kids in Korea are maybe one step ahead of, the Korean American kids in LA, and vice versa. The fact that, there are non-Koreans who some of them speak better Korean than I do. I find it, not so much embarrassing but more fascinating that, this is what's happened over the past, few years. So I think it's, exciting and liberating at the same time.
Someone who comes here to Seoul to visit or goes to Hongdae and experiences the music scene there, they'll get the sense that the music in Seoul there's a much greater variety than what they get exposed to on the international K-pop scene. Do you think that diversity is making its way to the sort of internationally available Korean music?
Well, one of the sort of dangers about when K-pop was sort of percolating and bubbling up was the perception that K-pop was just strictly teen idol dance music. It was very close to becoming almost a stereotype. And I was really glad that someone like Psy came along, because he's obviously not a teenager. Yes. But the thing is that his music style was able to show, wait a minute, K-pop actually has a little bit of diversity. Mm-hmm. And so I like to think of sort of K-pop's sort of definition as sort of evolving into sort of maybe like perhaps sonic bibimbap, in the sense that the music styles are all made of different ingredients. So instead of, in the same way bibimbap is made, you recognize all the different ingredients separately, but when mixed together it becomes something uniquely Korean. And, for a lot of Korean music that all of a sudden becomes popular, it could have, a rock bit here, an electronic bit there, a hip hop bit there, and obviously maybe a dance sauce thrown in for good measure. But when mixed together, all of a sudden it becomes somehow uniquely Korean. And, I think right now when we talk about K-pop, during the 90s, it was really about made for Korea. The K-pop was really made only for the Korean market. And then as sort of K-pop emerged over, say, the past 5 years, I think we could think of it as made in Korea, with the idea that whatever music was being made here was being exported. But with more Korean artists doing more things overseas, whether it's collaborating, whether it's recording, whether it's performing, I think we're now moving into a phase where it's more about made by Korea. And in the same way that Hyundai cars are, or Samsung products or LG products are made from parts and places all around the world, I think the same is true with Korean music, that it's no longer made in Korea, made for Korea, but more and more about made by Korea. And so, there are a lot of Korean artists, whether they're, boy bands, girl bands, rock bands, who could be working with songwriters in Scandinavia, or they could be recording tracks in LA, or they could be, collaborating with an artist in New York or in Tokyo or in Taipei. And, or doing an interview in London or something in Paris. And so just the fact that the Korean music industry has now sort of moved onto a bigger stage is incredibly fascinating and incredibly fun to watch and be a part of.
I guess Psy was a more appropriate spokesman for Bibigo than we realized.
I wasn't aware he was, Psy is a model and spokesperson for so many brands I've lost track. But I do think, though, that just sort of following, I'll sort of follow up. I think one of the things that's sort of fascinating right now is that now when we talk about K-pop, it's more sort of along the lines of Korean music as a whole. Right. And, I think that, the same way that we talk about the K-League or the J-League with football. I love football because it's the World Cup, so I'm on a different track. But, when you talk about the J-League or the K-League, you're talking about a bunch of different teams wearing a bunch of different uniforms. And I think and I hope that when we talk about J-pop or K-pop, that it's not about one style of music, but a whole different range of styles of music that are getting awareness. And what's really fun is we're starting to see that happening. For instance, there are, I believe, 3 Korean artists that are going to be debuting at Glastonbury this summer, arguably one of, if not the biggest festival in the UK. We had a record number of Korean music artists who happened to be urban acts, electronic acts, rock acts, who played at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, to, a packed, sold-out audience. And just the fact that we're seeing a wide range of Korean artists performing, touring, promoting, be it indie icon idols, not just in North America and Europe, but now South America. K-pop is globalizing, but not with one way or with one formula, but with a whole wide range. And I think that's sort of the direction that K-pop is moving towards. It's not about stereotype, but hopefully maybe if all goes right, different types of music that can play on different types of stereos.
So then as the world hears more diverse Korean music and it has that label effectively made by Korea, what does that label mean? What's the Koreanness retained there?
I think I take a lot of influence from how the Latin music scene broke out in North America and became mainstream. Because I think at the time when artists like Ricky Martin or Jennifer Lopez or Enrique Iglesias and Mark Anthony, et cetera, when they broke out in the early 90s, one of the reasons why I think American and international audiences embraced them was the music was accessible because there were bits and parts in English, and a lot of these artists could express themselves in English, but they retained that Latin flavor, whether it was the lyric, whether it was the chorus, whether it was the beats or instrumentation. And the fact that, now Latin or Latino music is a bona fide category at the Grammy Awards. Yes. It has its own charts and its own award shows in its own right. I hope that K-pop sort of moves in that direction and finds similar success that Latino music has. Or for that matter, reggae. Reggae, again, charts, awards, but it comes from a tiny country called Jamaica.
Yes.
And, Korea, I like to think, is a little bigger than Jamaica. Sure. But, I think the fact that reggae music has had such an impact worldwide. And, I think arguably, most people would look at maybe Bob Marley as that breakthrough guy that helped, reggae become so big and accepted worldwide. I think that Korean music and K-pop hopefully can move in that direction. But I think that what K-pop is trying to accomplish is nowhere near unique. I think there have been very successful experiences and, more importantly, experiments that the Korean music industry can learn from. I remembered when I took a flight back from LA to Korea a few years ago, and I actually asked myself, what am I doing? Why am I even doing this? Is there any...
One of those moments.
Is there any viability in trying to export Korean music? Because, back in 2008, 2009, it was considered, a pipe dream. But then, just by chance, I had gone to New York and I had heard a speaker talk about piracy. And, I've always thought about piracy as sort of this digital phenomena, but I never really thought about the root of the word piracy and how that actually came about. And the speaker from England had said that piracy was a good thing. And of course, my knee-jerk reaction is, no, that can't be. But then he explained why that was. And what he had explained is that the word piracy actually came from a music phenomena that happened in the 60s in the UK and in England, where these renegade DJs had actually gotten on boats and were broadcasting sort of really edgy, cutting edge music from their boats offshore and beaming those signals, beaming that music back into the UK. And by virtue of them being on boats and on ships and doing this, they were technically pirates.
International waters.
It was pirate radio. But if it wasn't for pirate radio, a lot of people who were living in the UK would not have known about this new music, not only from overseas, but more importantly, that was coming up in England, because at the time, entities like the BBC, they weren't playing pop music. They were playing pops music.
Yes.
Orchestral, basically elevator, dentist music.
Sure.
And for a lot of rebellious youth in the 60s, the rock and roll and the sort of blues and sort of, bands like, Led Zeppelin, The Who, and the Beatles, they were being more likely discovered through pirate radio that was beaming back in to England. And I had this sort of, wake up moment. You know what? That's something that maybe Korean artists might have to think of, is that if they want to get perhaps more acceptance in Korea, they may have to go offshore. They may have to go overseas, and they may have to come back into Korea. I wouldn't say necessarily through digital piracy, but definitely through another kind of blue ocean, which we would like to call the internet. And, I think what most people don't know is the British invasion that eventually made it over to America was largely sparked and spurred by the music that was promoted and that was programmed and that was played through pirate radio. And I saw this all in a Jack Black movie, which was called Pirate Radio. But
yes, I remember that coming out.
Yeah, and I think in different countries it has a different title. But I was watching that movie knowing that I just heard something similar about that in New York. And I realized, you know what? If this worked for the Brits in the 60s and in the 70s, why can't it work for the Koreans now? And so, I watched that movie over and over again, and I actually read the book and realized, there are a lot of parallels between what the British had accomplished and what the Koreans are kind of sort of trying to do. And so, again, this whole Korean wave and K-pop boom, I don't think is necessarily new. But I think, for me at least, a lot of lessons can be learned from the successes and, even at times the failures of other music from other countries, other genres. And so it's really interesting that I think that through a lot of trial and error and through perhaps a lot more hits rather than misses, that, the Korean music industry is sort of finding ways to, just not only, make new inroads, but perhaps find ways to go more mainstream.
What do you make of the fact that, now I'm not talking about the stuff that embarrassed you in the 90s and from the 80s, but the Korean music from the 70s and late 60s has kind of got a fandom going again. What do you make of that?
In many ways, the Korean music in the 70s was, in its own way, in its own right, a very unique golden age, because at the time, a lot of these Korean music artists were really sort of cultural centrifuges where they were not only adopting but really absorbing a lot of really rich sort of musical influences from overseas. And that largely, I think, had to do with the fact that there was a U.S. military basis here and there was a huge U.S. military presence. And so for a lot of these Korean music acts in the 70s, they were performing to large audiences who happened to be GIs, and at the same time were, hanging out and collaborating and learning from sort of all this music that was coming in from the West, particularly from the US. And so the reinterpretation and the sort of redefining of these Western influences through sort of a Korean filter, it really created just an amazing wealth of music that, if you hear some of it, you realize it's kind of derivative. But if you hear a lot of it, a lot of it's kind of innovative in the sense that, these really amazing Korean, particularly rock artists and R&B artists, a lot of soul artists, but spelled S-O-U-L for full,
Sure, soul artists.
Yeah, I mean, they were bringing so much passion and to the music they were making I know for a lot of contemporary artists now, a lot of rock artists, a lot of hip hop artists, I know even some of these EDM DJs, when they're looking for influences and inspiration and sampling, they're not going to the West. They're going back old school to check out some of the 70s Korean music, because some of the beats, some of the rhythms are just gold mines in terms of revisiting and reinterpretation. And in fact, one of the really, really exciting things that we catch once in a while is when a hot, say, Korean rock band does a remake of a 70s classic. And when you hear it, and particularly overseas audiences hear it, they're, whoa, where did this come from? And, it's this idea that the Young Turks, the new Bucks, are finding ways to pay tribute to, the old school pioneers, I think is great. And, there's just such a rich palette of music from the 70s that, unfortunately, if they didn't get their credit then, it's great that some of them are now finding credit now.
Finally, as just a listener, what do you want to hear in Korean music these days? Just you personally, what do you listen out for?
I like to listen to a wide range of music, obviously a wide range of genres, but the music that really catches my attention, excites me, are the ones that I can't put a genre to.
Yes.
The fact that there are certain Korean bands now that are not only finding critical acclaim here, but, critical awareness overseas, I think is fascinating. There's, for instance, a band called Jambonai that not many people in Korea knew about, but once they went overseas, people have been embracing them, and they played a great set at South by Southwest, and they're one of the bands that are going to be playing at Glastonbury. The fact that more Korean artists are becoming comfortable going overseas, and the fact that they're making music where they're more comfortable and confident singing parts of it in English as well as mixing it in Korean, I think is really exciting. And, there are times when a lot of artists ask, when we record our new music, should we do it all in English? And, I'm from America. I speak English fluently. And ironically, I actually tell them no. I tell them that, when you go overseas, sometimes what they're looking for is something new and fresh. And in fact, something Korean might actually be a plus rather than a minus. Mm-hmm. And, if they have sort of insecurities as to doubts as to whether or not their music could be accepted overseas, I have them listen to Sigur Rós. And I tell them, this foreign language you're listening to, it sounds beautiful. It's a completely made up language. It doesn't exist. And I said, there's someone out there, whether they're in Vietnam or in Vienna or in Venice Beach, who could be listening to your music and think, this is like Sigur Rós. But one of the reasons why I think, K-pop and Korean music has been so successful around Asia is the fact that, although the lyrics might be in Korean and, obviously blend in a way that's almost like melodic and it's an instrument in its own right, the choruses are often in simple enough English so that to an Asian music fan, Korean pop music is no different than US or UK pop music, because if English isn't their first language, they get it, they understand it, they feel it, they experience it, they want it. And so I think that, more Korean artists are becoming more comfortable finding that personal balance between keeping their music, both a little local and global. But the most important thing I tell them is that, once you perform the song, people want to know more about it. And so, when you do interviews, don't be embarrassed or ashamed to speak some English. Many Korean artists, their English is actually much better than they give themselves credit for. And there are times they're a little embarrassed.
So many Koreans.
Yeah, and there are times they're a little bit embarrassed about, maybe their accent. And I tell them, the accent actually might be something endearing and cute and something that might be even attractive. And, what I do is I often show them, interview clips of French artists, French DJs, whether it's David Guetta or Justice or Air. And it's like, listen to these guys speak English. It's not completely fluent and it's got a heavy accent at times, but people don't care. They want to hear more and want to get to know more about the artist. I said, you speaking with a Korean accent could be, it could sound like a really sexy French accent to someone who doesn't know better. Sure. And I think it helps that as more Korean artists are traveling and performing overseas, and at the same time, a lot of these music festivals and clubs here in Korea, we're starting to see more and more non-Koreans in the audience, bobbing their heads, slam dancing, whatnot. And so I think more Korean artists are just becoming more comfortable performing for, a more kind of diverse, dynamic market, fans, crowds, audience.
I've been speaking here in Garosu-gil with Bernie Cho. He is the president of DFSB Kollective. He's an expert on the Korean music industry. Bernie, thanks so much.
Thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I have been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to all the backers of Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea tour on Kickstarter. Adam Hartzell, Aidan Nullman, Alfred Lee, Andy Cooney, Angus Gordon, Bala Chenupati, Cam Smith, Chin Music Press, Dan Caraselli, Danny, Deborah Smith, Emmett Farragher, Umberto Grant, Ian Plosker, Ismail Kennedy, Jackie Gast, Jay Chang, Jeffrey Davis, James DeVito, Jonathan Filbert, Josh Paget, Kimberly Hahn, Manvir, Mark Hines, Matthew Workman, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Monica Eck, Michael Fransky, MJ Pritchett, Patrick O'Flaherty, Patrick Park, Piers Rippey, Robert Salzberg, Samuel Hansen, Sean Brown, Themistocles Crucis, Thomas Unterberger, Timothy Dobbs, and Wayne Wright.